I'll start by joining the chorus of thanks to the organizers. It's been a real honor to take part in this conference. As is well known, Greek and Latin are not the only languages that survive at Bérénice. There's Egyptian as well, plus some exotic languages such as South Arabian, Aksumite, and Tamil. My expertise, however, is in Greco-Roman sources, so I will survey only the Greek and Latin writings, which are extant in ostraca, inscriptions, and papyri, totaling well over 700 objects. Our earliest Greek text, we've in fact seen a picture of, is a fragmentary inscription dated to the second half of the 2nd century BC. It comes from the Great Temple and contains just part of a dating clause, that's all that survives, and a reference to a person with the rank of chief bodyguard. The latest text we have is the well-known temple dedication from Sikiot, which was put up at some point during the sole reign of Gallienus in the 260s. Insecurely dated material from the region, such as the possible gravestone for Abydos of Pharaon, found at Wadi Lama, pushes the extant Greek evidence as late as the 6th century. The bulk of written material comes, however, from the 1st century AD. It can be divided into two principal groups. The first are the ostraca belonging to the Nicanor archive from Coptos, which were first published in 1930. These are mainly receipts for the transport of goods between Coptos and Bérénice and Coptos and Myos Hormos. They are dated as early as 6 BC and as late as AD 68, with most written in the reigns of Tiberius and Claudius. The second group are texts that have been found in excavations conducted by Steve Sidebottom and his team over the past couple decades. These documents tend to come from the 3rd quarter of the 1st century, as late as the Emperor Titus. In addition to these two groups, there exists a handful of inscriptions from the reigns of Domitian and Trajan, which round out the 1st century and give us a peek at the 2nd. This brief sketch should give you some idea of the chronological horizon of our text. As for content, much of the documentation centers on the activities of bands of camel drivers. In fact, if I had to give my talk a subtitle, and if there were not some exceedingly interesting texts that were not related to camel drivers, I might have called it a century of camel driving around Bérénice. The camel drivers, who were organized in groups called decanii, or 10 packs, each of which was led by a decanos, provided crucial support to operations throughout the eastern desert, whether quarrying, trade, or other. These individuals, mainly men, but the occasional woman, bear mostly Egyptian names, many of them theophoric, as well as mixed Greek-Egyptian filiations. Their family-operated businesses, if we can call them that, survived multiple generations. Viewing Bérénice through the lens of the camel drivers allows us to consider a number of important topics addressed often indirectly by our texts, such as trade, religion, the Roman army, society, and culture. Let us look at our first group of ostraca, the receipts from the Nicanor archive. Nicanor was a camel driver, and he and his brothers and sons ensured delivery of goods to agents at Myos, Hormos, and Bérénice, who were acting on behalf of merchants, some of whom were big international traders, and others leading local men, especially from Coptos. The most common commodities found in the ostraca are wheat and wine, but we also have receipts for pharmaca, medicines and other agents, some of which may have been used for textile dyeing. The receipts also concern deliveries of barley, lentils, anise, hemp, leather bags, oil, bread, wood, and clothing. We usually cannot tell if the goods were meant for people living in Bérénice, or for outgoing sailors, or for sale abroad. E. Denneker and K. van Dorp have suggested in a study of amphora seals that wine and pharmaca were the primary export goods, and that wheat was for local consumption. The Periplus, however, claims that wheat was an export commodity, if in only small amounts, and it's possible that some of the shipments were intended for foreign markets. The best way to illustrate the contents of the Nicanor ostraca is to let them speak for themselves. The first receipt was submitted to Nicanor by an agent of the merchant Marcus Julius Alexander. In it, this agent, a slave probably named Cosmos, and acknowledges delivery of planks of linden wood, which are assigned to the account of his master, Marcus Julius Alexander. The date is July 14th, 43. The merchant is illustrative of one of the types of people involved in trade in the eastern desert. Marcus Julius was a member of a prominent Jewish family at Alexandria. His brother, Tiberius Julius Alexander, was prefect of Egypt. His uncle was the philosopher Philo. His father, Alexander Arabarch at Alexandria, was the magistrate responsible for the collection of customs dues. Marcus himself was married to the daughter of King Herod Agrippa I. We're thus talking about high society by any measure. Marcus Julius Alexander is not the only merchant of high standing who appears in these receipts. There is at least one other Arabarch, possibly two, and one high-ranking equestrian named Gaius Norbanus Ptolemais, who served simultaneously as Euryticus and Idios Logos in the reign of the Emperor Nero. In addition to these merchants, we also encounter imperial freedmen with commercial interests at Bérénice. Notable among them is Gaius Julius Epaphroditus, a slave of the house of Augustus. He is mentioned in nearly a dozen ostraca from the Julio-Claudian period that have been found in the early Roman dump at Bérénice, which is circled in red there, and in one plaster jar stopper, probably from AD 18 or 19. A third group of merchants comprises members of the local Egyptian elite. An important and well-attested representative of them is the family of Paminus, son of Parthenius, who, along with his sons Parthenius, Paniscus, and Synpnuthus, appear in both petrological and inscriptional sources. The family belonged to the Egyptian priestly class at Coptos, and some of their names are common to the area. Paminus, the name Paminus, and Paniscus, for example, point to the cult of Min-Pan, the principal god at Coptos, and are thus typical of local onomastics. Indeed, many Egyptian names attested in Bérénice during this period reflect the primary cults in and around Coptos, namely those of Min-Pan, Isis, Harpocrates, Horus, and Geb. Paminus and his family appear as merchants in about 10 ostraca from the Nicanor archive, in which their account is credited with shipments of wheat. In a receipt dated to the year 29, an agent called Hariothes, another local name which means the healthy Horus, acknowledges receipt at Bérénice on the account of Paminus and his son Paniscus of 24 artabas of wheat. If we knew nothing of his family, we might have supposed that Paminus and sons were just some Hellenized locals operating a trading business, but we do know more. In addition to the ostraca, there are over 20 Greek and Egyptian inscriptions from Coptos that attest above all Paminus' son Parthenios. In these, he is usually described as a representative, that's Greek prostates, of Isis, and in one he dedicates, together with his father Paminus, a peribolos to Isis, Harpocrates, and Pan. The inscriptions concerning Parthenius date from the reigns of Tiberius to Nero. Here is a typical example of a dedication. It was erected for the god Kronos, Isis' father, on July 5th, 32. The Greek part of it reads, on behalf of Tiberius Caesar Augustus, year 18, Epiph 11, for Kronos, the greatest god, Parthenius, son of Paminus, prostates of Isis. A bilingual hieroglyphic demotic stele from the reign of Nero paints a very similar picture of Parthenius, where again he is said to be Isis's servant. The importance of Isis not only at Koptos, but also at Bérénice, is something that we will return to. The sheer number of inscriptions attesting Parthenius, plus his family's obvious high standing in the Nicanor archive, combined to show the family's prominence within the Coptite community of elite Egyptian families. It should be noted, too, that a decanos, one of these caravan leaders, named Parthenius, son of Paminus, appears in the water archive discovered at Bérénice in 2009. It's tempting to identify him with the man we've been discussing, who's attested as early as AD 21 and as late as the early 60s, but given the presumed date of the water archive in the reigns of Vespasian and Titus, it might be someone else, who knows, perhaps a member of the same family. In the Nicanor ostraca, we get our earliest evidence for international trade at Bérénice. Texts found in the early Roman dump at the site and published in O Bérénice 1 and 2 by Roger Bagnall, Arthur Verhoecht, and Christina Helms expand this view. The majority of these documents are orders to allow passage through the gate at Bérénice. They were issued by customs agents at Koptos to colleagues at Bérénice for camel drivers delivering goods to the harbor. By allowing passage, the ostraca presumably confirm receipt of customs dues at Koptos. Unlike the Nicanor text, the customs passes are seldom dated, but archaeological context, individuals attested also in other texts, and the few dates that we do get suggest a time frame in the third quarter of the first century. The customs passes are especially valuable for the light they shed on some of the export commodities that were sent to Bérénice, above all Italian and Laodicean from Syria wine. We know from the Periplus, in fact, that precisely these two wines were sought at the Axumite port of Adulis and at Baragadza in India. This example addressed by a man bearing the Semitic name Robios, who tells those at the gate in Bérénice to let Heracles pass with his 20 hollow-lidded jars of Italian wine and 28 Laodicean, which are to be loaded onto the ship Ace ex Artismon. It's just one example. As an aside, I will mention that in addition to Greek, Roman, and Egyptian onomastics, records from Bérénice offer the occasional Semitic, for example, Palmyrene and Nabatean, as well as Thracian, Celtic, Germanic, and even barbarian names, that is, those of barbarians resident in the eastern desert who interacted with the Greek and Latin speakers. Such diverse onomastics lend a multi-ethnic feel that is characteristic of a port city. Supplementing what we have learned about trade operations from caches of ostraca, such as the customs passes, two Greek inscriptions found in 2015, which we've seen already in the nice video and in other talks, in an enclosed area in the courtyard of the Great Temple, which Roger Bagnall and I recently published, have given us welcome information about the bureaucracy that supported trade, as well as insight into local religion. Although the texts were incised more than 60 years apart, one is from the year 49 and the other from 112, they are both concerned with the office of the receiver, or paralamptes, and both commissioned by secretaries, grammates. The paralamptes was a customs official who worked at Myos Hormos and, as the new inscriptions tell us, also at Bérénice. He was presumably not the same as the officer with this title in Alexandria and Laukekome, who oversaw collection of the 25% state tax. Our paralamptes was responsible for assessing imported goods at the port and for their storage and later delivery. The earlier inscription is a dedication to Isis, the greatest nurse goddess, Trophos Megaste. It was commissioned by Irenaeus, son of Harpocration, the secretary of the department of the Paralamptes. The second, later inscription accompanied a statue of the receiver of Bérénice, the Paralamptes Berenices, Gaius Julius Faustinus. It was commissioned by the secretary of the spice magazine, the Apotheke Aromatike, Gaius Julius Alcharistos, a possible freedman whose act of dedicating a monument to the Paralemptes gives good indication of the importance and high standing of the receivers in the eyes of those who relied on them, such as their secretaries. We knew from the so-called Musairus papyrus of a public storage facility at Koptos, which are taxes on imported goods were presumably paid there. Reference to a spice magazine at Bérénice shows that storage facilities existed at the harbor too. There, the pepper, myrrh, frankincense, nard, malabathron, and other spices and aromatics coming from the east were probably first assessed and then sealed before delivery to Koptos and from there to Alexandria. A small proportion of the imports might have been unloaded for consumption at Bérénice and other places in the eastern desert. In addition to shedding some light on customs administration, the first inscription provides insight into local religious practice, which I would like to dwell on for a moment. Of all the deities attested in Greek inscriptions, Zeus and Isis are the most common at Bérénice, each the recipient of 3 dedications. We saw the prominence of the goddess Isis at Koptos in our examination of Parthenius, son of Paminus, the merchant and prostates of Isis. By calling her Isis Trophos, the dedication found in 2015 gives us the first explicit textual evidence for her very common iconographical representation as the nurse of her son, Harpocrates Horus. The earliest stele to mention Parthenius, son of Paminus, that dedication of the Peribolus to Isis, Harpocrates, and Pan, set up by Paminus in the year 21, shows us Isis in precisely this guise. I've circled it there. And there is more evidence for the cult of Isis at Bérénice. Reliefs on the facade of the Great Temple featured her and Harpocrates, and Wilkinson's papers record finding a damaged figure of Isis and child. Moreover, many of the reliefs in the temple dating to the time of Tiberius are said to have featured Isis and Osiris. Finally, a private letter preserved on a papyrus discovered in 2011 mentions a sanctuary of Isis, although it is unclear if the sanctuary was located in Bérénice. The papyrus is said to have been found near a wooden stylus and a cat mummy. Given the association of Isis with cats, the mention of cats alongside a large quantity of roses in an ostraca found in 2000 could reflect activity within her cult. In addition to texts featuring Isis, 2 water receipts edited in O Bérénice 3 refer to deities. One alludes to a mysterious sanctuary called the Indelicasterion of the supreme god Kronos, and the other mentions the goddess Bérénice, presumably the deified Bérénice the first. The texts are brief and not primarily concerned with the deities they refer to, so we do not learn anything more than the possible existence of their cults. With these water receipts, we arrive at the final stop on our camel driving tour, the water supply archive discovered in 2009. It consists of around 175 ostraca, mostly Greek, but 4 Latin and 10 bilingual Latin-Greek documents. The ostraca document camel transport of water to Bérénice under the supervision of the Roman army. More than anything, they give us the identities of camel drivers and their caravan leaders, as well as names of military units, especially companies and individual infantry and cavalrymen. What they do not offer, unfortunately, are specifics about the cisterns and wells from which the water came, the distances traveled, and the date and circumstances of delivery, whether, for instance, the archive reflects routine operations or an extraordinary event. For the most part, the water receipts contain a standard set of elements, the ordering of which can vary. We get the name of the decanos, to whose decania the camel driver belonged, the name and patronymic of the camel driver, the military unit receiving the delivery, the name of the soldier who signed off on the transport, the amount of water delivered, which is measured in Greek karamia and Ptolemaica, or in Latin amphora. Here's a representative Greek example. The camel driver's name is Petenminus, son of Heracles, a member of the Decaneia, led by Pacoibus, son of Cleitos. The recipient of the shipment of 15 karamia is a Bleros, a cavalryman in the terma of the Decurion Aprianos from the regiment of the Ala Apriana. There are Latin and bilingual examples, which I won't comment on. In total, the water archive yields names of 24 decanoi and dozens of camel drivers, including a woman named Tapiomis. Most of the soldiers and squadron leaders named are not associated with a particular regiment, but we know of the presence of 3 auxiliary units at the harbor, the 2nd and 3rd Iturian cohorts and the Ala Apriana. The 2nd Iturian cohort was stationed in Egypt for over a fairly long period, from as early as AD 39 down to the time of the compilation of the Notitia Dignitatum at the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century, where it is said to be based in the Heracleopolite nome. The 3rd cohort is less well attested. The 3rd Iturian cohort is less well attested, although it is mentioned in a diploma from Egypt dated to AD 83. It does not figure in the Notitia. Its earliest mention seems to be in an agreement or receipt from the 3rd quarter of the 1st century, which involves troops from both Iturian cohorts. Most other documents that attest it date to the 2nd century, a few to the 3rd. On the whole, the evidence shows the cohort in Egypt for at least the first 2.5 centuries of this era. The 3rd regiment found in Bérénice is the Ala Apriana, a cavalry unit said to have been stationed at Hipponos in Middle Egypt. It appears in documents from elsewhere in the Eastern Desert and from Coptos, but the Water Archive connects it for the first time with Bérénice. Its known presence in Egypt spans AD 40 to 270. All told, the archive names around 15 squadron commanders or decurions and nearly 25 cavalrymen plus 19 sentries and about 50 soldiers. Many of the sentries presumably belong to other cohorts beside the 2 Iturians, even legionary cohorts perhaps, but we do not get the names of these regiments. A few of the soldiers and commanding officers also appear in texts from Didymoi, illustrating mobility among the troops of the Eastern Desert. Although we cannot know exactly what the soldiers were up to, their remit probably included oversight of building programs such as fortlets and wells and cisterns, in addition to providing security. The drilling of a well and the construction of a cistern and fort at Sikiot in the year 76-77 were commemorated with this Latin inscription. Copies of similar commemorative texts have been found at water stations in Didymoi and Aphrodite. Soldiers oversaw a hydrological project, as we know from ILS 2483, which is a list of units involved in the construction of cisterns at Bérénice, Campassi, Apollonos, Hydrama, and Mios Hormos. We could imagine that the Water Archive was relating to building activities in the area. Coincidentally, the archive is broadly contemporaneous with the Sikiot dedication. Whether construction of the fortlet and cistern at Sikiot was undertaken in order to counter increased security threats in the desert is impossible to say. There is no evidence for disturbances in the 1st century text from Bérénice. In fact, the best witness we have to encounters with area barbarians is this papyrus found in the Roman dump that records the distribution of provisions to several barbarians who have names such as Ayametok and Chotiate or Choniate, and to their unnamed wives. The document suggests, if anything, relative harmony, although it is admittedly difficult to draw conclusions just from this one papyrus. This is about as far as our camel drivers will take us today. In concluding my talk, I wish to look at one more aspect of the written evidence that I haven't mentioned, signs of literary interest at Bérénice. In 2012, the team made the exciting discovery in the early Roman dump of a fragment of Greek poetry, which Julia Lugavaya and I published last year. The papyrus is the most extensive example of a literary text to be found at the site thus far. The other bits of literature that have turned up have been too poorly preserved to reveal their contents. The two-columned fragment concerns an attendant of the Phrygian goddess Cybele, also known as Magna Mater. The attendant may be Attis or one of the cult priests who were called Gali. He or she is depicted in the papyrus in a frenzied state, tossing the hair around and clashing cymbals to the accompaniment of the Phrygian flute. The genre of the poem is unclear. It is reminiscent of a comedy of Menander entitled the Theophoromene, the girl possessed by a god, but could also come from tragedy or even a collection of songs or lyric poems. If the verses are from a collection of songs, they might have been of an occasional type, such as those performed at a local festival or for a song competition. Whatever its genre, the poem gives some flavor of cultural interests in the Eastern Desert, suggesting that it was not all work and no rest. Who knows, perhaps even our camel drivers took an occasional break from transporting goods to enjoy some of the entertainment. Thank you.
Bien, merci beaucoup. Je ne doute pas que cette communication va susciter quelques commentaires de nos amis papyrologues, à tout le moins.